Hi to all of our Speak Up readers. We are here today sitting with Rachel Monroe, who is a writer and the author of Savage Appetites, Four True Stories of Women, Crime, and Obsession, which explores women's relationship with the true crime genre. She's also a contributing writer at magazines such as The Atlantic and The New Yorker. Rachel, thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you for having me.
So let's get started. According to your findings, what is it about true crime that attracts so many women? And what do the women who are drawn to the genre have in common, if anything, really?
Yeah, I mean, in some ways it's a very simple question, and in some ways it's a really big question. And I think that's when I first started looking into this, I was like, oh, there's a lot more here than I expected. There are some people had written things out there, had kind of tried to give answers to that question. And they seem to me to be like a little overly simplified. People would say like, oh, women read about true crime because they want to learn tips to avoid being murdered by a serial killer. And I was like, well, that's not quite it, or because women have so much empathy or something, and all of these different ideas seem to be maybe a part of an answer, or an answer for one person but not for another. And so the more that I was looking into it, the more I was like, oh, this is a question that deserves a whole book to answer, because there are so many different kinds of true crime, and there are so many different ways that readers and watchers and listeners interact with it. True crime can be really, for some people, it can be all about learning about the criminal psychology and the fascination with that world. And other people, it's like much more, the focus is much more on the kind of the detective side of things, right? Like wanting to the mystery aspect, and the like crime solving, the clues and the solutions. For some people it's much more about thinking about justice. And I think that's, a lot of women have the experience of being maybe not believed or not listened to, or they're having their concerns dismissed. And so I think in some ways that makes them drawn to this idea of miscarriage of justice or something like that. And then there are the people who are really like compelled by empathizing with the victims. And so like all of those different ways of relating to these stories, being interested in these stories, there's a lot of overlap, but there's a lot of difference too. But I mean, the one thing that I did find consistent in working on this book was that everybody that I spoke to who had a true crime podcast, or worked for a true crime TV network, or wrote true crime books, it was really consistent. They're like, the audience is like overwhelmingly female. And so there really is like something there, but I think it's hard to give a simple answer as to what it is. I have a number of theories in the book, but
Yeah, definitely. And going from there, we see people give all sorts of reasons for why they are into true crime, like you said. One of these, though, is to seek justice for the victims, right? When you look at this, do you see an attempt to justify an otherwise sort of voyeuristic practice with a more morally acceptable motive? And if it is the case that our motives to get into true crime aren't based, at least not fully, on altruism, but simply, say, on the search for entertainment, is that something we should be ashamed of?
I think that's a really good question. And that's something that I turn over in my head a lot, because I do think that for many people, maybe the majority of the true crime enthusiasts that I've spoken to, and I include myself in that, like this is a genre that I spend a lot of time with. that motivation of like feeling connected to the victim, feeling empathy for the victim, wanting justice for the victim. That's like a very strong through line, I think, for a lot of people and a lot of women who have been victims themselves in some way or another, you know, presumably not murder, but like victims of other kinds of exploitation, of violence, of coercion, of manipulation. I think these stories can help us sort of understand and relate to and sort through those experiences in our own lives, and sort of connecting with the victim is a way of connecting with those parts of ourselves that have been victimized, if that makes sense. And so I think in some ways there is a very there can be something very important and very deep and very like psychological that goes on there, like that with these stories. I think that's very present. But at the same time, I think that is also mixed with this sense of voyeurism, like you said, this idea of feeling almost entitled to know everything about a crime, you know, to like really the most intimate details of a victim's life and a victim's death. And feeling like, because I connect to this in some way, or I'm interested in it, or I'm drawn to it, it's somehow mine. And that's kind of the point of the book. It's like, it's all about women who feel this almost ownership over crimes that didn't happen to them. And you're like, wait, this wasn't, you know, this didn't happen to you or your sister or anybody that you know. So why is this? Why are you so obsessed with this? Like, what are you really obsessed with? And I think that, when it crosses the line, sometimes for me, yeah, the justification is often, I'm doing this is for the victim, this is on the victim's benefit, to the victim's benefit. But it if you look at it, it isn't really. I mean, I thought about this a lot. This happened after the book came out, but last year, Gabby Petito, the young woman who was murdered by her boyfriend, and was kind of, that was an unfolding case in the US for a while, and there were a lot of pictures of her. She was, you know, very prolific on social media and very beautiful, and like such an awful story. And there was just so many TikToks and like these enormous Facebook posts and Reddit posts, and people were just like picking over her whole life and analyzing everything, and her family and all of her friends and all of her relationships. And if you kind of push back on it at all, you know, they would say, no, it's justice. It's justice for Gabby. And I think, I'm sure that element was there for some people, but I think sometimes that that idea of, or that justification of, you know, we're doing this is for the victim, is a shield to avoid thinking about some of the darker motivations. And often in these cases, you'll find, you know, the victims' families are saying, you know, like, the almost the attention, particularly for these cases that get really big, the attention from the media and the true crime community can be really violating at a time when they've just suffered this incredible loss. I think particularly sometimes on the internet, we seem to be able to forget that these stories are like, that they happen to real people, you know, that these are not like characters on a TV show. We're not writing fan fiction that, you know, when you have that like the statements that you make and all the sort of obsessing, like, has a real life consequences for real people who've suffered a real loss.
Also, somehow related to this, maybe in terms of what is driving us, right? Do you think the explosive consumption of true crime we currently see has to do with the mental health struggles that are currently widespread? What is, if any, the connection between the two?
Yeah, I think that's a very good insight, and that there are a lot of people struggling. I mean, that excuse me, it was an interesting sort of through line in writing the book, was, and examining these different crime stories, was like how often I could sort of see these moments at which a situation that was bad, a relationship that was tense, got much worse when the economic situation got worse, or somebody lost health insurance, or somebody lost a job, or somebody got sick. And often that's sort of like the tipping point at which an uncomfortable or just kind of normally bad situation like tipped over into really awful. And so I think that's, for me, that's often like I found like what I'm reading for in these books is sort of to try to the crime happens and you're kind of trying to like walk it back and sort of be like, okay, when could you see it? When did it begin? When could you see, when could the path have gone another way? And I think, again, for people who have experiences in their own life of, dealing with people in crisis or dealing with situations that feel like they're spinning out of control, reading these stories helps you gain a perspective on your own life. It's almost like seeing the most extreme or amplified version of what an abusive relationship looks like, helps you see the contours of it, if they're there in your own life or in your own relationships. And so I do think that there's like this desire to understand, like what is going on in people's heads when they do really terrible things. And also because like, if by understanding it a little bit more, we can avoid it or solve it.
Yeah, absolutely. Then a bit more personal. Is there a true crime you are yourself particularly obsessed with? Is there a specific mystery you'd wish to see solved the most? Like, I feel like sometimes we, like, us who are into true crime, like a lot of people, do have that one or couple of stories that are, that they want to see solved, that they want to see, I think sometimes genuine justice, for the victim. And yeah, just to see them resolved, within your own lifetime, I guess.
Yeah. Do you have one? I'm curious.
Actually, this is one that I actually, usually I'm all for, well, we don't have to justify everything we do. This is very voyeuristic and that's okay. But in this one instance, I've actually, felt genuinely very bad and sad about the situation, particularly. And it's the case of Emanuela Orlandi, which is very famous in Italy. And I think you've probably heard about, there's a huge Netflix documentary now. So I think that would probably be mine. Yeah.
I think I sort of have two answers to that question. Like the one that really, the story that's always obsessed me is the Manson family, and particularly the Manson girls. And I write about it a little bit in my book. And that's not so much like I think we're pretty clear on who did what. There are various conspiracy theories that posit, something more complex going on. But I'm less sort of drawn to that by the mystery of who did it than like kind of wanting to understand how that could happen, how people, and particularly these young women, could be drawn into this. And I think part of the answer is they're so young. I mean, I got really obsessed with that case probably when I was around the same age as a lot of those girls, like 16, 17, and feeling both like that I could relate to them and that there was like this chasm, and I couldn't relate to them at all. And so that's always like that kind of limit of identification is really fascinating for me. And then in terms of, like cases, like unsolved cases, who did it, getting the answer, I think the case of the West Memphis Three, which I write about a little bit in the book, because I spent a lot of time with the wife of one of the men who was wrongfully convicted in that case. That's just a really sad story. These three young boys that were killed in the woods, and then three boys, charged with the crime and sent to prison for a crime that they didn't do. So you sort of have this compounding tragedy. And I think there's been understandably such a focus on getting those three men out of prison that sometimes there has been less attention paid on like, okay, well, if they didn't do it, then somebody did, and they're still out there. And there's been a real resistance in that case from the law enforcement in West Memphis and in the state to go over DNA evidence. Like they have DNA evidence that they are resistant to test, because I think they still maintain, you know, like, no, those three guys did it. We got the right guys, and they don't want to open it back up, because that might lead to questioning of their own flaws, the exposure of the mistakes that they made. And so that one feels like one that's very upsetting, because like the potential for answers feels really close at hand, but the powers that be are sort of blocking those answers from arriving. And that's like really frustrating. And you just think about, you know, it's destroyed the families of these three boys as it would anybody, and the town. And yeah, that's one I would really love to see answers on.
Mm-hmm. And do you see the huge kind of politicization? Like there's some kind of hyper politics at the moment, it feels, in the like public sphere in general, definitely in the US, which is where you're from. And I don't know, I guess, do you see true crime somewhere like falling somewhere in this momentum, let's say? We don't have to establish whether it's positive or bad, or like, you know, we
Sure.
don't need to like draw a massive conclusion about what are the best politics ever,
Yeah.
how to, you know, get them across even. But I was wondering, is true crime, does it fall somewhere in this, you know what I mean?
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, it was funny because like some of the like just a handful of people like on Amazon or whatever reviewed my book and was like, oh, I like the book, but like too much politics in this book about crime. And it was funny to me because I was like, crime stories are almost always like so political, in this idea that you could go to a book about crime and expect it to like not have any politics. And it was like really kind of funny to me. But because I was interested in like, not, there's a political aspect to the factors that, you know, cause crime and crime rates and trends in crime. But then there's also kind of more interesting to me, because I'm not like a criminologist, is the way that certain cases like get used and get picked up, and certain crimes get amplified and get a ton of attention, and other crimes like get ignored or get no attention at all. And I think that's like we start to see the politicization of certain of these like big sensational crimes. I mean, I write about that a little bit in the book, like starting you know, in the 80s and 90s, this idea, this sort of crime panic that was like stoked by the Reagan administration, and there was a big crime spike then, but the victims who got sort of like picked to be featured, and the people who were kind of invited to imagine themselves as victims, generally like middle-class white people, versus who was actually being victimized by crime. And so I do think that like, because crime stories are so visceral, you know, they really like get us at this very kind of deep, immediate level. They can be really effective political tools, and so they can often like be and politicians understand that, so they use them. And it's funny because you'll see, like, if you, depending on what magazines you read or what, you know, news channels you watch, like some crimes will be covered over and over and over again, and then you know, you turn to the channel with the other politics and it's not there at all. You know, it's just like what gets the attention.
Yeah, you mean it's basically being used for whichever purpose the given person has. And
yeah, like a symbolic purpose. I mean, I think, you know, there was a really sad case here maybe a decade ago of a young woman who was killed by a stray bullet. Like a guy, I don't remember the circumstances. He wasn't trying to shoot her, but the bullet, like, she was killed. And it was a man who was like in the country illegally. And Donald Trump made a huge thing about this and would talk about it in all his speeches. You know, this young woman, like beautiful young blonde girl, like killed by an illegal immigrant, you know, say this over and over again. And her family was like, please don't do this. You know, this is like traumatizing to us. We don't want you to like make our daughter's tragedy like into, you know, like your political speech. But it was a very kind of convenient story for the rallies, and so in that way it sort of took on a life of its own as like the symbolism of it that got kind of detached from the reality of her experience and her family's experience. So like those, you know, those stories can really travel.
No, and it's at the end of the day, obviously, like when we talk about true crime, we can't ignore the true crimes. Like
Right.
we're talking about that genre, but I really love what you did there, which is, you know, you kind of highlighted how these are real crimes, actually. That's kind of the point. And obviously, once that's true, then they are going to be used in all sort of ways. And I'm sure there can be good that comes out of it. But obviously not in the case that you just mentioned, which is, yeah, just a clear example of the manipulation that gets done. And yeah, so these were basically our questions.
Great.
I love true crime, honestly.
Yeah, me too, obviously.
Yeah, I mean, we obviously love it. Anyway, yeah, this was kind of your view on the whole topic, and you have an expert one, so we are very happy to have had you here. Thank you so much. And yes, please keep investigating on the topic.
I will. Thank you so much. I could talk about this stuff forever, so it was a pleasure.
For us too. Thank you so much.
Have a great day.
You too.